During the first night of March 1943, the German submarine U-415, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Hans Joachim Hess, rose to the surface in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 400 miles to the west of Ireland's coastline. The waters were placid, clouds blocked any moonlight, creating ideal circumstances. His officer on watch informed him that they could see less than 50 meters ahead. Hess gave orders to post the bridge lookouts and start the diesel motors. The recognizable rumbling commenced as the vessel's twin supercharged diesel engines roared to life, their emissions forming a thin fog that spread across the black waters. The lookouts on the bridge swept the skyline with their Zeiss binoculars, the finest optical instruments German manufacturing could offer. They observed nothing whatsoever. The heavens were vacant, the sea was vacant. They existed in complete isolation within the darkness, precisely as anticipated. What remained unknown to them, what they had no means of discovering, was that a Royal Air Force Wellington bomber fitted with ASV Mark III radar technology was monitoring their position from 12 miles distant, observing a luminous signal on a cathode ray display that revealed U-415's precise coordinates with a clarity that would have appeared unthinkable mere months before. The bomber adjusted its course toward the detected target, reducing altitude from 8,000 feet. The aircrew prepared their depth charges and readied the lee light, a searchlight installed in the plane's underside capable of producing illumination equivalent to 240 million candles. Hess and his bridge lookouts maintained their visual scanning, perceiving nothing, hearing solely the wind, the diesel engines, and the water moving against the hull. They experienced a sense of security. Their assessment was incorrect. At a distance of 1 mile, the Wellington's pilot engaged the lee light. The ocean surface exploded in intense white brilliance. U-415 sat exposed in the center of the light column, her grey hull distinctly visible against the dark water. Hess observed the aircraft for the initial time, already committed to its assault approach. He screamed the warning. The bridge lookouts plunged toward the access hatch. The diesel motors were still operating. There existed no opportunity to submerge. The Wellington dropped 4 depth charges in a calculated arrangement to impact it within 20 meters of the submarine's hull. The explosions thrust the vessel upward from the water. The pressure hull fractured. Seawater poured into the rear sections. U-415 descended stern first, carrying 38 men with her into the frigid Atlantic depths. Hess and 6 others, who had been topside when the assault occurred, managed to survive, rescued from the waters hours afterward by a British destroyer. When interrogators questioned Hess about how the aircraft located him in total darkness, he possessed no explanation. He had been surfaced for fewer than 8 minutes. Visibility had been nearly non-existent. There should have been absolutely no method for the enemy to pinpoint his location. Nevertheless, they had discovered him as though they could penetrate the night itself. This discovery, this seemingly impossible detection under conditions where detection should have been unattainable, was occurring repeatedly across the Atlantic with growing frequency during early 1943. German submarine commanders who had functioned successfully 4 years were perishing without comprehending how the enemy located them. The darkness that had consistently shielded them had become see-through to a technology that them remained unaware existed. To grasp the scale of this transformation, to comprehend what it signified to men who had constructed their complete tactical approach around the shelter of nighttime, requires understanding what submarine operations had been before this technological revolution occurred. The submarine had commenced World War II as an instrument of concealment and persistence. The German Type 7 submarine, which constituted the core of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, was engineered around a particular operational philosophy. When submerged, operating on electric motors supplied by enormous lead-acid batteries, the vessel could move at approximately 7 knots for several hours before the batteries depleted. Maximum underwater velocity was 7.6 knots, sustainable for perhaps 1 hour before the batteries exhausted. Traveling submerged at 4 knots extended battery duration to approximately 80 hours theoretically, although practical factors and safety considerations reduced this substantially. However, at the surface, operating on her twin diesel motors, the Type 7C could achieve 17 knots sustained velocity with a range of 8,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. The diesel engines accomplished more than propulsion. They also powered generators that restored the batteries, returning the vessel's capacity to dive and operate underwater. This meant that in practice, German submarines spent the majority of their time surfaced. They journeyed to and from their patrol zones on the surface. They crossed the Bay of Biscay on the surface. They hunted for convoys on the surface. They positioned themselves for attacks on the surface, submerging only for the final approach and torpedo launch when aircraft compelled them downward. The calculations are straightforward and merciless. A submarine that remained submerged could not patrol effectively, could not reach distant operational zones, could not maintain extended missions. The batteries controlled everything. Without the capability to service and operate the diesel engines, a submarine was essentially stationary, restricted to several days of operations before returning to base. Surface operations were not merely preferable. They were the basis of the complete submarine campaign. And surface operations during nighttime had consistently been secure. British aircraft had pursued German submarines since 1939, but their capabilities were constrained by the most fundamental limitation of human eyesight. A person with binoculars, even superior binoculars, scanning the ocean from an aircraft at 1,000 feet elevation, could observe perhaps 3 to 5 miles during daylight under perfect circumstances. During nighttime, he could perceive virtually nothing. Moonlight might disclose a surface submarine at half a mile if the observer happened to look in precisely the correct direction, precisely the correct instant. A dark night, clouded or without moon, rendered visual detection essentially impossible. The British had attempted to adjust with searchlights, installing powerful lights on patrol aircraft and illuminating the ocean surface. However, this necessitated knowing where to search. An aircraft searching at random, illuminating sections of ocean hoping to discover a submarine, would consume its fuel well before covering even a minute portion of the search zone. The ocean was simply too enormous, the submarine too small, the darkness too complete. German submarine commanders grasped these constraints intimately. They had developed their tactics around them. The established procedure was firmly established and had been demonstrated effective through years of operations. Journey to the patrol zone surfaced, submerging only when aircraft were sighted. Once positioned on station, surface during night to charge batteries and search for targets. Dive at sunrise to avoid daytime air patrols. Stay submerged during daylight hours, moving slowly on electric motors, preserving battery capacity. Surface again at sunset and maintain operations throughout the night. If an aircraft was spotted during night operations, dive immediately, remain underwater for 30 minutes, then surface and continue. The aircraft, having lost contact, would be miles distant, searching uselessly in the incorrect area. This approach had succeeded. It had succeeded in the early war period when operating independently. It had succeeded during the expansion of wolf-pack tactics when multiple vessels coordinated assaults on convoys. It had succeeded as operational zones expanded westward across the Atlantic, beyond the reach of most British aircraft. Night surface operations were the cornerstone of everything commanders accomplished, and they possessed absolute faith in the protection darkness delivered. That confidence was constructed on experience and reinforced by achievement. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, who destroyed 47 Allied vessels, totaling over 280,000 tons, before his capture in March 1941, had operated chiefly on the surface during nighttime, executing attacks with such intensity that he sometimes torpedoed targets from within the convoy formations themselves. His tactics were examined, analyzed, and instructed to new commanders as the exemplar of effective submarine warfare, corvette Captain Gunter Preen, who infiltrated the British home fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow in October 1939 and destroyed the battleship Royal Oak, had navigated on the surface through supposedly impenetrable defences, using darkness and meticulous seamanship to accomplish what British planners had deemed impossible. These achievements and hundreds of others similar to them demonstrated that surface submarines operating during nighttime were effectively invisible. The doctrine was confirmed by outcomes. Between June 1940 and December 1941, German submarines destroyed over 8 million tons of Allied shipping. The period from January through August 1942, after Germany declared war on the United States and submarines commenced operations along the American coastline, witnessed even greater success. American coastal cities had not yet instituted blackout measures. Merchant vessels sailed individually without convoy protection, outlined against the glow of city lights. Submarine commanders termed it the second happy time, and they operated with near complete freedom, surfacing within sight of shore, attacking at will, diving only when convenient. During those months, submarines destroyed over 600 ships in American waters. The commanders who accomplished these successes trusted completely in their capability to operate undetected during nighttime. They had learned through experience that darkness meant security, that surfaced operations under a dark sky carried minimal danger from air assault. This conviction was not superstition or hopeful thinking. It was tactical doctrine validated by years of operational proof. The British simply could not locate surface submarines during nighttime. Consequently, night surface operations were secure. Consequently, the batteries could be charged, the patrol zones could be reached, the war could be prosecuted effectively. The complete submarine campaign rested on this foundation. What the submarine commanders did not realize, what they could not realize in those early months of 1943, was that the foundation had already disintegrated beneath them. The protection they depended upon no longer existed. The darkness that had consistently concealed them now hid only their ignorance of how thoroughly the tactical circumstances had transformed. The technology that rendered their vessels visible through the night had been deployed, tested, and perfected. It was hunting them at that precise moment, and they possessed no awareness it existed. The technology that shattered German confidence in night operations was not a solitary invention, but a convergence of advances in radio wave physics, electronic engineering, and airborne tactics. The account begins not with a dramatic breakthrough, but with patient work in British laboratories and testing facilities, driven by the acknowledgement that visual detection of surface submarines during nighttime was insufficient for winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Radio detection and ranging, known by the acronym radar, had existed in primitive form since the mid-1930s. The British chain home system, a network of coastal radar stations, had proven invaluable during the Battle of Britain, providing early warning of German aircraft formations crossing the English Channel. However, these early radars operated on relatively long wavelengths, measured in meters, and required massive fixed antennas. They were useful for detecting large objects like aircraft at considerable distances, but completely unsuitable for installation in aircraft or for detecting small targets like submarine conning towers. The breakthrough arrived from research into centimetric wavelengths. Our ADIO waves measured in centimeters rather than meters. In February 1940, to British physicists John Randall and Harry Boot, working at the University of Birmingham, developed a device called the cavity magnetron. This was a vacuum tube capable of producing radio waves at a wavelength of 10 centimeters with power outputs previously impossible at such short wavelengths. The cavity magnetron made compact, powerful radar systems practical for the first time. The implications for submarine detection were immediately evident to British scientists and military planners. A radar operating at 10 centimeter wavelength could detect small objects at useful ranges. It could be constructed small enough and light enough to install in patrol aircraft, and it would be largely immune to the countermeasures that were beginning to render longer wavelength radars less effective. The German Navy had already developed a radar warning receiver called Metox, which detected the emissions from British ASV Mark to radar sets operating at 1.5 meter wavelength. When Metox detected radar transmissions, the submarine commander received warning and could dive before the aircraft closed to attack range. Metox was effective because the long wavelength radar had to transmit from relatively long distances to be useful, giving submarines time to react. A 10 centimeter radar changed the equation completely. The shorter wavelength meant the radar could achieve useful detection ranges with much lower power. It could be designed to provide precise range and bearing information, and most critically, existing German radar warning receivers could not detect 10 centimeter transmissions. The physics of their receiving antennas made them inherently insensitive to such short wavelengths. A submarine equipped with Metox, relying on that device to provide warning of air attack, would receive no indication, but a centimetric radar was tracking it. Development of the ASV Mark III radar proceeded rapidly through 1941 and early 1942. The system used a rotating antenna mounted in a streamlined housing under the aircraft's nose. The antenna transmitted pulses of 10 centimeter radio waves and received the echoes reflected from objects on the ocean surface. These echoes were displayed on a cathode ray tube screen showing range and bearing to the target dot. An experienced operator could detect a surface submarine at ranges exceeding 12 miles under good conditions, and reliably at 8 to 10 miles even in rough weather or sea clutter. The first operational ASV Mark III sets were installed in Royal Air Force Coastal Command aircraft in early 1943. Wellington bombers received the equipment first, followed by Liberators, Sunderland flying boats, and other patrol types. Crews trained intensively on the new equipment, learning to interpret the radar displays, to distinguish submarines from surface ships or navigational hazards, to coordinate radar detection with visual acquisition in the Lee light searchlight. The tactical procedure was straightforward, but required precise execution. The patrol aircraft flew its assigned search pattern at altitude, typically 6,000 to 8,000 feet, with the radar operator monitoring his screen for contacts. When a contact appeared, the operator called out range and bearing. The pilot turned toward the contact and began descending. As range decreased, the radar operator provided continuous updates, guiding the pilot toward the target dot at approximately 1 mile range. When the aircraft was positioned directly over the contact and had descended to attack altitude of around 250 feet, the pilot activated the Lee light, the 24-inch diameter searchlight, powered by a dedicated generator producing sufficient electricity to create 240 million candle power of illumination, turn the night ocean surface into brilliant daylight for a circle approximately 1 mile in diameter. The surface submarine, if still on the surface, appeared clearly in the center of the illuminated area. The pilot had perhaps 30 seconds to position for the attack run before the submarine could dive to safety. Depth charges were released in a carefully calculated pattern designed to bracket the submarine's position. Even if the submarine began an emergency dive the moment the light activated, it could not submerge quickly enough to escape. A Type 7C submarine required approximately 35 to 40 seconds to dive from full surface condition to periscope depth, where the top of the conning tower was just submerged. Reaching safe depth, where depth charge explosions would not crush the pressure hull, took over a minute. The aircraft, traveling at 160 miles per hour, could cover the final mile and release its weapons in less than 25 seconds. The mathematics were brutally straightforward. If the radar detected the submarine before the submarine detected the aircraft, the submarine could not escape. German submarine commanders began experiencing these attacks in February and March of 1943, but they didn't comprehend what was occurring. The pattern was always identical: surface during nighttime in conditions of limited or zero visibility, running diesels to charge batteries or transit to patrol areas, maintaining watch with lookout scanning the dark sky. Then, with no warning, brilliant light and the sound of aircraft engines suddenly close. Emergency dive procedures initiated, but too late. Depth charges exploding, hull damage, casualties, all for those less fortunate. The boat torn apart by explosions and sinking immediately. The survivors, who were rescued and interrogated, reported the same confusion. No radar warning from their Metox receivers. No visual or audible detection of approaching aircraft. Just sudden attack from darkness with no warning. Some commanders speculated that the British had developed new tactics, perhaps following submarines from great distances after visual detection during dusk, then attacking hours later. Others wondered if the Allies had some new form of infrared detection that could locate submarines by the heat of their diesel exhaust. A few suspected radar, but their Metox set showed nothing, and they knew British radar operated at wavelengths their equipment could detect. The truth became undeniable through accumulated evidence that no alternative explanation could account for. In the first 6 months of 1943, submarine losses increased dramatically. January witnessed 15 boats destroyed. February saw 19 boats lost. March, the worst month yet, witnessed 15 boats destroyed in the first 2 weeks alone. The trend continued and accelerated. April losses reached 15 boats. May was catastrophic, 41 submarines destroyed, the highest monthly loss of the entire war. Many of these losses occurred under circumstances that made conventional explanation impossible. Submarines attacked during nighttime in mid-ocean, far from any possibility of visual detection. Submarines attacked in weather conditions, where visibility was measured in meters, not miles. Submarines attacked within minutes of surfacing, before any visual search could possibly have located them. Submarines attacked repeatedly in the same patrol area, as if the enemy knew exactly where they were despite taking extensive evasion measures after each attack. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the submarine force, recognized that something fundamental had changed. The operational reports from returning commanders and the interrogation reports from captured survivors painted a consistent picture. The British could detect surface submarines during nighttime with accuracy and reliability that visual search could not explain. In late May 1943, Donitz made the painful decision to temporarily withdraw submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. For the first time in the war, the submarine offensive was suspended, not due to lack of targets or shortage of submarines, but because losses had become unsustainable. The withdrawal marked an admission, not yet fully articulated, that the fundamental premise of submarine operations had been invalidated. If surface submarines could be reliably detected and attacked during nighttime, then the entire operational concept was compromised. Batteries still needed charging. Transit to patrol areas still required surface running. The diesel engines still needed to operate. But none of these necessary activities could be conducted safely if the enemy could find surface submarines through the darkness. German naval intelligence worked desperately to understand the new Allied capability. Captured equipment from downed British aircraft eventually provided the answer. In June 1943, a Wellington bomber was shot down over occupied France. The wreckage was recovered and examined. Among the debris, German technicians found the ASV Mark III radar set, still partially intact. Engineers dismantled the equipment, studied the cavity magnetron, measured the wavelength, and understood immediately what they were facing. The 10-centimeter radar represented a technological capability Germany had not achieved. The cavity magnetron design was more sophisticated than German equivalents. The system integration, combining the radar with tactical searchlights and weapons delivery, showed operational maturity that indicated months or years of development and testing. Most critically, the 10-centimeter wavelength meant that Metox and all other German radar warning receivers were useless. The submarines had been sailing blind, trusting in warning equipment that could not detect the threat hunting them. Dönitz ordered immediate development of a radar warning receiver capable of detecting centimetric transmissions. The device, called Naxos, entered production in late 1943 and began installation on submarines in early 1944. However, Naxos was a defensive measure, a way to detect that you were being hunted. It did not solve the fundamental problem that surface submarines were now vulnerable to detection and attack under conditions where they had previously been safe. The technological advantage had shifted decisively to the Allies, and there was no immediate way to recover it. The psychological impact on submarine crews was profound and destructive to morale. Men who had trained 4 years, who had survived multiple patrols, who had developed confidence in their skills and their vessels, suddenly faced an enemy capability that negated their experience and expertise, the careful protocols they had learned, the tactical procedures they had practiced, the operational security they had maintained, all became inadequate overnight. Darkness, which had always been an ally, was now transparent to the enemy. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, described the experience in his post-war memoir. Surfacing during nighttime for a day submerged, running diesels to charge batteries, maintaining careful watch, the bridge lookouts constantly scanning with their binoculars, the radar warning receiver silent, showing no indication of threat. Then, without any warning, the sky erupting in brilliant white light, the aircraft already committed to its attack run, clearly visible in the searchlight's reflection, the emergency dive alarm, the crew rushing to stations, the diesels still running because there had not been time to shut them down properly, the depth charges exploding as the boat passed through 15 meters depth, not yet deep enough for safety, the hull flexing from the pressure waves, the lights failing, the emergency systems engaging, and the knowledge, absolute and unavoidable, that they had been completely vulnerable and had not known it. Kremer survived that attack. U-333 suffered damage but remained operational. However, the experience changed his approach to surface operations. He became cautious, nervous, constantly aware that invisible enemies might be tracking his position. The confidence that had characterized his earlier patrols was gone, replaced by wariness and the certain knowledge that surfacing, even during nighttime, even in conditions of zero visibility, meant exposure to attack. Other commanders reported similar psychological shifts. Men who had previously surfaced routinely, who had conducted night operations with assurance, became hesitant and fearful. Some commanders began surfacing only for minimal periods, running diesels just long enough to partially charge batteries before diving again, accepting reduced operational capability in exchange for reduced exposure time. Others attempted to surface only in extremely bad weather, hoping that rough seas would create radar clutter that might hide their echoes. A few commanders began keeping their boats submerged for extended periods, attempting to use snorkel equipment that allowed diesel operation while at periscope depth. However, the early snorkels were unreliable, prone to flooding, and reduced speed to a crawl. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, before the widespread deployment of centimetric radar, submarines had destroyed over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, while losing 87 boats. In 1943, after ASV Mark III radar became operational throughout Coastal Command, submarines destroyed approximately 2.4 million tons, while losing 237 boats. The exchange ratio had reversed catastrophically. The submarine force was being destroyed faster than it could sink merchant shipping, and there was no technological solution available within Germany's industrial and scientific capabilities. The men who continued to serve aboard submarines after May 1943 did so with full knowledge that their survival odds had diminished to near zero. New crews arriving at the submarine training facilities in Gdansk and Pillau received technical instruction on equipment and procedures, but they also received the unofficial education that passed between veterans and newcomers in quiet conversations away from officers. The experienced men told them the truth. Centimetric radar made night surface operations a calculated risk that would likely end in death. The darkness no longer protected you. The British could see you when you couldn't see them. Your warning equipment would not alert you. Your first indication of attack would be the searchlight, and by then it would be too late to dive to safety. Despite this knowledge, the patrols continued. Germany's strategic situation demanded it. The submarine campaign, even in its diminished state, still tied down enormous Allied resources. Every submarine at sea required the Allies to divert aircraft, escort vessels, and merchant shipping to protective convoys rather than offensive operations. Dönitz argued repeatedly to Hitler that the submarine force must continue operations regardless of losses, because forcing the Allies to maintain their anti-submarine infrastructure was itself a strategic contribution. The argument had merit from a purely strategic perspective, but it meant sending men to sea in vessels that had become floating coffins. The technological competition continued, but Germany was losing. New radar warning receivers like Naxos provided some capability to detect centimetric transmissions, but they had limitations. The receivers could only detect radar with relatively close ranges, often too late for the submarine to dive to safety before the aircraft closed to attack distance. German engineers developed radar-absorbent coatings to reduce the submarine's radar cross-section, but these materials were only partially effective and degraded quickly in salt water. The Navy experimented with anti-aircraft armament, increasing the number of 20mm and 37mm guns on submarine conning towers, hoping boats could remain surfaced and fight off attacking aircraft. This tactic resulted in some successful engagements against individual aircraft, but more often, it simply meant the submarine remained on the surface longer, exposed to attack from multiple aircraft or from follow-up strikes after the first attacker was driven off. Snorkel equipment, which allowed diesel operation at periscope depth, was retrofitted to existing boats and incorporated into new construction from mid-1943 onward. The snorkel solved some problems while creating others. It allowed battery charging without fully surfacing, reducing radar exposure. However, snorkeling was slow, limiting the boat to perhaps 6 knots maximum speed. The snorkel valve, designed to close automatically when waves washed over it, frequently malfunctioned, either failing to close and flooding the boat, or closing unnecessarily and creating dangerous pressure changes as the diesels continued running and drew air from the sealed hull. Crew members suffered injuries from the pressure fluctuations, including ruptured eardrums and sinus damage, and even snorkeling offered incomplete protection because the snorkel head itself created a radar return, smaller than a fully surfaced submarine, but still detectable. The Type 21 submarine, introduced in limited numbers in the final months of the war, represented a genuine technological leap. This design incorporated a streamlined hull shape optimized for submerged performance, massive battery capacity that allowed sustained underwater operations, and snorkel equipment integrated from the initial design phase. The Type 21 could achieve 17 knots submerged for brief periods, faster underwater than most escort vessels could manage on the surface. If deployed in significant numbers earlier in the war, these boats might have altered the tactical balance. However, they entered service too late, into few numbers, and with insufficient crew training to affect the outcome. Most Type 21 submarines never completed operational patrols before the war ended. For the men serving aboard conventional submarines through 1944 and into 1945, the war became a matter of endurance and probability. Each patrol was a calculation of odds. You surfaced because you had to surface. You ran the diesels because without battery charge you couldn't operate. You maintained watch and hoped your radar warning receiver would provide alert in time. and you knew with certainty born from statistical reality that each successive patrol reduced your chances of survival. The official German Navy statistics compiled after the war showed that of approximately 39,000 men who served aboard submarines during World War II, 28,000 died, a mortality rate of over 70%, making submarine service the deadliest military assignment in the German armed forces. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, achieved through the combination of centimetric radar, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, convoy tactics, and code-breaking intelligence, had consequences that extended far beyond sinking submarines. Every merchant ship that successfully crossed the Atlantic carried supplies that sustained Britain's war effort and supported the build-up of forces for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. The defeat of the submarine campaign meant that American industrial production could be delivered to the European theater without unacceptable losses. It meant that troops, equipment, fuel, and ammunition could cross the Atlantic in quantities necessary for offensive operations. It meant that the starvation blockade Germany hoped to impose on Britain failed completely. The strategic implications were decisive. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, required the transport of millions of tons of supplies and hundreds of thousands of troops across the Atlantic over a period of months. This concentration of shipping would have been impossible if submarines remained an effective threat to merchant convoys. The Allied air campaign against Germany, which escalated through 1943 and 1944, required continuous supply of aviation fuel, bombs, and replacement aircraft, all transported across the Atlantic. Strategic bombing could not have been sustained at the intensity and scale that characterized 1944 and 1945 if shipping losses remained at 1942 levels. The defeat of the submarine threat allowed the Allies to conduct the war on their terms, with logistical superiority that Germany could not match, and that defeat came not from superior seamanship or tactical brilliance, although both contributed, but from technological advantage in a single critical capability, the ability to detect surface submarines in darkness. The cavity magnetron, developed in a British university laboratory, manufactured in factories across Britain and America, installed in hundreds of patrol aircraft, changed the strategic balance of the Atlantic War more decisively than any individual battle or tactical innovation. For the submarine commanders who survived the war, the experience of technological obsolescence was a bitter education. Many had begun their service convinced of German technical superiority, confident that their training and equipment were equal or superior to Allied equivalents. The revelation that British radar technology had surpassed German capabilities, that the devices they relied upon for warning were ineffective against Allied equipment, that their submarines were vulnerable to detection through methods they did not understand, was a profound psychological blow. Some, like Peter Creamer, wrote memoirs after the war, attempting to process these experiences and understand how completely the tactical situation had shifted beneath them. Others never spoke publicly about their service, carrying the memories of men who had trusted their lives to darkness that was not dark enough. The technical details of ASV Mark III radar, once among the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied war effort, became public knowledge after the war ended. German engineers examined captured equipment and read technical papers describing the cavity magnetron's operation. The physics were not particularly complex once explained. Radio waves of 10 cm wavelength transmitted impulses, reflected from metal objects on the ocean surface, received and displayed on a cathode ray tube. The innovation was not in principle, but in execution, building a device compact enough and reliable enough to install in patrol aircraft, training operators to interpret the displays accurately, integrating the technology with searchlights and weapons delivery systems, and deploying the equipment across an entire air arm with sufficient operational security that the enemy remained ignorant of its existence until too late. The lesson was absorbed slowly and painfully by those who experienced it. Technological advantage in modern warfare could be decisive regardless of courage, training, or tactical skill. Submarine crews were not inferior sailors or less dedicated than their predecessors who had achieved great successes earlier in the war. They operated the same type of vessels, using the same tactical procedures, but they faced an enemy capability that negated the fundamental premise of their operations. The night surface running that had been safe became suicidal. The diesel charging that had been routine became a calculated risk. The darkness that had always protected them became transparent to invisible eyes in the sky. The account of German submarines and centimetric radar is ultimately an account about the erosion of certainty. Men went to war believing certain things were true, that darkness provided protection, that their equipment was adequate, that their training prepared them for the threats they would face. They discovered through hard experience and mounting casualties that these certainties were false. The world had changed, while they operated under assumptions that were no longer valid. The technology that made them vulnerable had been developed, tested, and deployed without their knowledge, and by the time they recognized its existence, the strategic balance had already shifted irreversibly. For the young men who climbed down the ladder into a submarine's pressure hull 1944 and 1945, knowing what the veterans knew, accepting the odds they understood to be against them, the decision to continue represented either extraordinary dedication or resignation to fate. They surfaced their boats during nighttime because operational necessity demanded it. They ran the diesels and charged the batteries because without power they were helpless.